Hello, everyone. I want to welcome everyone to the English department's first reading of the year. I'm Matt Irvin. I'm chair of English and creative writing here. It's my great pleasure to turn over the introduction duties here to Dr. Misha Rai, who is new at Sewanee this year in fiction writing, and I will turn this over to you.
Thank you, Matt. Katie Kitamura is the author of 4 novels, the most recent of which is Intimacies, one of the best books I've read in the last year. And the New York Times agrees because it is listed as their 10 best books of 2021. It is also one of Barack Obama's favorite books of 2021. Intimacies was longlisted for the National Book Award and the Penn Faulkner Award, and was a finalist for the Joyce Carol Oates Prize. Her third novel, A Separation, was a finalist for the Premier von Razori and a New York Times notable book. Her other 2 novels, Gone to the Forest and The Long Shot, were both finalists for the New York Public Library's Young Lions Fiction Award. Her work has been translated into 21 languages and is being adapted for film and television. A recipient of fellowships from the Lannan, Santa Maddalena, and Jan Mikulski Foundations, Katie has written for publications including the New York Times Book Review, the New York Times, The Guardian, Granta, Bomb, Triple Canopy, and Freeze. She teaches in the creative writing program at New York University. Please welcome Katie Kitamura to the stage.
Thank you so much. It's really lovely to be here. I've taught for the last 2 summers at the Writers' Conference, so I have incredibly warm feelings about Sewanee. When we drove kind of into the campus, I just felt immediately very happy and contented to be back. So it's also a place where I've gotten a lot of writing done over the last 2 summers. So thank you for having me. Thank you for coming out. I'm going to read, I think, 2 passages from Intimacies, and then hopefully if you have questions or we can just have a conversation. Yes, sorry. Is that better? No, that's not. It is better. Okay, thank you. Intimacies is about an interpreter who leaves New York and travels to The Hague to take a job at a war crimes tribunal. And I would say about a third of the book is set in the world of this tribunal, in the world of international criminal justice. And then a lot of the other book is really set within the day-to-day life of this character. So I'm going to read 2 sections. One is set in the court, and then the other one is preoccupied with her personal life. And so this is a section in the court. As I sat down at my desk, I recalled an anecdote Amina had told me not long after I arrived at the court. It was a story I thought of often. She had been tasked with interpreting for the accused, working in Swahili, and was briefly the only interpreter on the team with adequate fluency to perform the task. Her booth partner did not have a strong grasp on the language and said in private that her mind had drifted during the lengthy sessions. She listened to the originating English and French, but less closely to Amina's interpretation. But Amina herself was under considerable pressure. She was negotiating marathon sessions that were far longer than standard. She sat in the mezzanine level booth, the accused positioned directly below her in the courtroom. He was still a young man, a former militia leader, wearing an expensive suit and slouched in an ergonomically designed office chair. He was on trial for hideous crimes, and yet he simply looked, as he sat, sullen and perhaps a little bored. Of course, the accused are often in suits and in office chairs, but the difference lay in the fact that at the court, the accused had not merely been dressed up for the occasion, but were men who had long worn the mantle of authority conveyed by a suit or uniform, men who were accustomed to its power. And they had a kind of magnetism, in part innate and in part heightened by the circumstance. The accused had an aura when they were brought to The Hague. We had always heard a great deal about these men. We had seen photographs and video footage, and when they finally appeared in the court, they were the stars of the show. There was no other way of putting it. The situation staged their charisma. In the case of this particular man, he was not only young and undeniably handsome, but he had a dazzling air of command. Even without the aid of the courtroom, it was easy to see why and how so many people had obeyed his orders. But it was not even this, Amina explained. It was the intimacy of the interpretation. She was interpreting for one man and one man alone, and when she spoke into the microphone, she was speaking to him. Of course, she had known when she had accepted the post in The Hague that the substance of the court would be darker than the United Nations, where she had previously been working. After all, the court concerned itself exclusively with genocide, crimes against humanity, war crimes. But she had not expected this kind of proximity. Although she was never face to face with the accused and was always safely ensconced behind the glass-fronted interpreter's booth, she was constantly aware that she and the accused were the only two people in the courtroom who understood the language she was speaking. Over the course of these first sessions, Amina grew increasingly uneasy. The case involved a great deal of testimony regarding atrocity, and hour by hour, she carried this testimony from one language into another. She found herself on occasion struggling to control the tremor in her voice. She felt herself becoming entirely too emotional. But then, as quickly as the second day, and for reasons she didn't fully understand, a certain hardness overtook her. She discovered a new and acerbic tone, not exactly neutral, perhaps even reproachful. At one point, as she relayed the details of an embezzlement scheme, something that was morally questionable but a trifle compared to the other charges against the man, she found herself using a voice of cold disapproval, as if she were a wife scolding a husband for some small domestic failing, neglecting to do the dishes, for example, rather than addressing his rampant infidelity, or the fact that he had gambled away their life savings. At that moment, to her surprise, she saw the accused turn his head and look up in the direction of the interpreters. Until this point, he had sat almost entirely still, staring straight ahead, as if the proceedings had nothing to do with him, as if the entire matter were beneath him, although the result, Amina thought, was not the appearance of dignity. Rather, he looked like a sulky teenager being reprimanded for some infraction for which he refused to repent. There were perhaps half a dozen interpreters seated in the mezzanine-level booths. It was unlikely that he would know which one of them was his. She had never before noted him observing them. She forced herself to keep her voice steady and focus on the job at hand. The last thing she wanted to do was get distracted. Nonetheless, she was unable to keep from surreptitiously watching the accused as his gaze swept the glass-fronted booths. Perhaps feeling her eyes upon him, he suddenly stopped and looked directly at her, turning in his chair in order to do so. Amina couldn't help it. She stumbled over her words, apologized, nearly lost the thread of what was being said. He continued to stare at her, a grim expression of satisfaction settling into his handsome face, perhaps because he had succeeded in intimidating her and causing her to falter. She felt at once, even through the glass wall dividing them, the totality of the man's will. She shivered and looked down. She resumed interpreting, scribbling on her pad as if making notes. When she looked up again, he had turned and was looking straight ahead once more, his face soft and brooding. He never looked at her again. However, she found that her voice had shifted. Despite herself, she had been cowed. The next time she was required to recite a litany of the horrific acts perpetrated by the accused, her voice took on a pleading tone, in response to which the accused gave a thin smile. Somehow, she had become uncomfortable with the idea of confronting the man with his crimes, these heinous accusations that she was not making herself, but was simply interpreting on behalf of the court. "Don't shoot the messenger," she almost added, before remembering that this was precisely the kind of thing the accused did. It might even have been on the list of crimes, actually shooting the messenger. Although she knew there was nothing the man could do to her, she could not deny that she was afraid. He was a man who inspired fear. Even while sitting immobile, he radiated power. Still, it was not primarily fear that she felt, but guilt. She felt guilty toward the accused, who not only was a terrible man, but a man for whom she bore no personal responsibility, apart from adequately interpreting what was said in the courtroom and doing her part to ensure that he received a fair trial. She bore no responsibility for his happiness. She doubted that the man had been happy since he had been taken into custody by the court. He was a man entirely without morals, and yet the sentiment she felt toward him was moral in nature. It was illogical. It didn't make any sense. She concluded that it was a man's magnetism which had persuaded thousands of people to commit terrible acts of violence. Again, there was nothing bureaucratic or banal about him. He was a leader in every sense of the word, she thought, as she leaned toward the microphone and continued to interpret, steadily and without pause. He did not turn to look at her. He never did again after that first instance. But it was, she thought in retrospect, her first encounter with evil. So that's kind of one strand of the novel. And then another strand of the novel is about a sort of iffy relationship that the central character becomes embroiled in. And this is a scene early in their relationship when she learns something that she didn't know about her boyfriend, who's called Adrian. And I should add that I was talking a lot with Adam Ross, the editor of the Swanee Review, about set pieces. And he kind of said that he thought that set pieces were the organizing principle of my writing, and that's absolutely true. I kind of feel like I write the set piece and then I try to find the connective tissue between them. So this is a little bit of a set piece. It was probably the first one that I wrote for this book, and hopefully it won't be too long. Adrian was the reason why I wanted to stay in The Hague, or at least one of the reasons, though I was embarrassed to admit this even to myself. I did not like to think of myself as a woman who made decisions in this way for a man, particularly when things were still so nascent and the situation so complicated. We had met only 4 months earlier, but there was already a certain amount of routine to the way we were together. That regularity had many possible meanings and was difficult to interpret. At times, I thought it was the expression of an intrinsic ease between us, some deep familiarity superseding our many differences. But at other times, it seemed it was a product of habit, and that he knew no other way of being with a woman. Habit because Adrian was married with children, although the situation was at once less stark and more difficult than it sounded. He had been left by his wife a year earlier. She had left him for another man with whom she was now comfortably ensconced, not in The Hague or Rotterdam or Amsterdam even, but in Lisbon. She had left the country altogether, removing herself from the bad weather and the marriage and sending for the children 1 month after she had gone. The children, who had been neither taken nor left by her, the arrangement was not entirely clear, not even now, 1 year later. I had learned this not long after we had first met. I had gone with Adrian to a party. We were at the stage when nothing had been declared between us, and when he introduced me to people at the party, there was no purpose beyond the introduction. I was not yet his girlfriend, or date, or even necessarily someone he was sleeping with. Perhaps because of that apparent neutrality, it didn't seem especially awkward or significant when a man, not unattractive, of a similar age and general disposition to Adrian, not as handsome but entirely presentable, so that I was by no means displeased when I saw him approaching, drew me aside and asked how long I had known Adrian. The question didn't sound loaded. Presumably he had seen us arrive together. Not very long, I replied. He nodded, as if he had expected this answer. I wondered then if Adrian regularly turned up to parties with different women, none of whom endured for a second outing. I knew relatively little about him at the time. We were standing on a bridge suspended across a large atrium, which is full of stylish and glamorous people. It was the launch of a city-wide cultural fund. Below, waiters circulated through the crowd serving canapes executed with outlandish precision. My eyes followed a waiter as he weaved across the atrium, carrying a tray of miniature grilled cheese sandwiches, pausing as party guests plucked up the carefully charred triangles. He passed a tall man. I realized after a moment that it was Adrian. Very surprising what happened, the man standing beside me said. I nodded, distracted, as if I knew what he was talking about. Adrian was deep in conversation with a woman whose back was turned toward me. As I watched, she waved her hand through the air. Adrian leaned closer, as if he had not quite heard the words she had spoken. His handsome face bowed down to hers. A moment later, she laughed, tossing her head back to reveal her throat. I knew her quite well, he said. I looked up at the man beside me. He had put a great deal of product in his hair so that it stood up in rigid and glistening waves. He obviously wished to emphasize the plenitude of his tresses. At his age, many men had already begun to lose some or all of their hair, but the effect was a little absurd. He looked not like a virile man in the prime of his life, but rather like a juvenile and inexperienced teenage boy who had not yet learned how to manage his appearance. They were a bit of a golden couple, he continued. I think they even met at university. Over the years, they grew to resemble each other, both tall, good-looking, eventually both successful. It just goes to show, the man said, a sneer crossing his near-handsome face, how little you really know of what happens inside a marriage. The utterance was entirely commonplace, but I was startled. At that point, I didn't even know that Adrian was, or had been married. I turned to look at the man, who was gratified either by the small attention or my expression of surprise, and smiled smugly. Even from the inside, he continued encouraged, what do you really know of your own marriage? One day you realize you're living with a stranger. It must have been like that for Adrienne. She left in such a horrible way. She went away to Lisbon for the weekend and never came back. He didn't even know what to tell the children, whether or not she would be returning. They're teenagers, the worst possible age for something like that to happen. I nodded and said mechanically that adolescence was difficult enough with that kind of interruption. Apparently she sent Adrian an email, the man continued. One would have expected a call at the very least, don't you think? And I had to agree. There was something cruel about sending an email. It was too convenient a mode of communication for a matter so grave. Still, Gabby has always been very honest with Adrian, the man said, and that's something, isn't it? When did this happen? I asked. The man shrugged. Less than a year ago. She left in the dead of winter. Perhaps she had enough of the bad weather. I looked through the glass sides of the atrium. That night, too, rain was falling. I took out my phone and looked up the weather in Lisbon, a balmy 70 degrees and sunny. The man self-consciously touched his lustrous hair before asking if I wanted another drink. Below us, Adrian was still speaking to the woman. She must have said something amusing because he laughed, his eyes still on her. Even from a distance, I could see that he was interested in this woman. I was suddenly gripped by the definite sensation that he would leave the party with her, having arrived with me, the feeling so vivid, it was like a premonition. The woman turned. She set her glass on the tray of a passing waiter. For a fleeting moment, I saw her profile. She had small but pronounced features, a face full of clarity. Winter in Lisbon is meant to be wonderful, the man said. I excused myself. I could bear his presence no longer. The man seemed surprised. Perhaps he thought he'd been making some headway. I crossed the bridge and descended the stairs, rejoining the party below. I made my way towards Adrian. He looked up. Immediately he stretched out his arm to stop me. Where have you been? He asked, and he turned to the woman he'd been speaking with. She put her hand out and introduced herself, her manner friendly and perhaps a little curious. As we spoke, Adrian casually placed his hand at the back of my neck. She moved away soon after, almost without leaving an impression. As Adrian turned toward me, it seemed odd that I had been so threatened by this woman, someone clearly of minimal significance to him, and with whom he had only been making small talk. But I had also only been making small talk with a man on the bridge. I'd been away from Adrian for no more than 10 or perhaps 20 minutes. Nonetheless, in that brief span of time, he had been transformed. I looked at him and his handsome exterior. He in no way seemed like a figure unmanned, someone nursing a private wound. And yet, he had been abandoned by his wife in the cruelest and most humiliating manner. He was now a figure to be whispered over at parties, a man whose most intimate catastrophe was the stuff of idle and malicious gossip. He looked around the party. His manner was a little restless, and as I watched him, contours appeared to his face that I had been unable to see before. For better or worse, he was now a more complicated figure in my imagination. He asked if I wanted to get some fresh air and said he wanted a cigarette. Sadly, he had started smoking again. He was not looking at me as he spoke, and I didn't ask what had caused this resumption of a habit that, from his expression, he had clearly struggled to lose. He took my elbow and steered me toward one of the many covered balconies that lined the atrium. The rain had not slackened, and the balcony was empty. He took out a cigarette. He was about to light it when the glass door to the balcony opened again, and the man from the bridge entered. Adrian looked up. He didn't immediately greet the man, although it was obvious that he recognized him. I thought that was you slipping away with the young lady, the man said. Adrian didn't reply. He played with the cigarette between his fingers for a moment longer, and then slipped it into the breast pocket of his suit jacket, as if to save it for later. Adrian remained silent as he regarded the man from the bridge, who now appeared a little nonplussed. Despite the aggression of his own greeting, he was clearly taken aback by the coldness of Adrian's reply. Do you two know each other? Adrian asked at last. His manner was casual. I could see from the way he spoke that he made no presumption of prior acquaintance. It was more that he wished to downplay the introduction, as much as say, this is not a man worth knowing, not a person who warrants a formal introduction. The man gave a wolfish grin. To my horror, he reached out and wrapped his arm around my waist. We're the best of friends, he said. He did not look at me, but trained his gaze on Adrian, who suddenly reached into the pocket of his jacket and took out the cigarette after all. The man's touch was damp and somehow sticky, even through the layers of my clothing. It wasn't the nature of his skin, whether or not his palms or fingers were perspiring, but rather the quality of his grip around my waist that gave this impression. It was like being embraced by a squid or an octopus, a cephalopod of some kind. Adrian lifted the cigarette to his lips. He regarded us with an expression that was suddenly wary, his eyes hooded. Perhaps he imagined that the man was an old boyfriend of mine, although at that point I had barely been in The Hague long enough for such a thing to be possible. More plausible was the possibility that we had shared a casual sexual encounter, 1 or 2 nights together. I could easily imagine the man's record was made up almost exclusively of such minor events. The man gripped harder, his arm tight around my waist, and his thumb now rubbing at the waistband of my stockings through the fabric of my skirt. A slow and regular movement, both lewd and gratuitous. He was virtually a stranger to me. I didn't even know his name. Adrian lowered his head to light the cigarette, and I pulled myself away. "We spoke up on the bridge just now," I said. "I got lost, looking for the bathroom." Adrian exhaled, a wreath of smoke rising up around his face. He waved his hand as if to clear it. "I don't even know your name," I said to the man. "I don't think you introduced yourself. You said only that you were a friend of Adrian's." The man frowned. He had shoved his hands into his pockets when I moved away, and now looked even more like a petulant teenager, like someone who had been caught in the act. Adrian was watching him. He did not say anything, and the man did not introduce himself to me either. "I was a friend of Gabby's," the handsome man said at last, "or rather, I was a friend of Gabby's first." Adrian still didn't say anything. He was not looking at me. In that moment, it was as if I were not present at all, not only to Adrian, but also to the man who had turned to meet Adrian's gaze. The 2 men stared at each other. I understood then that there was some history of animosity between them, that the man had not approached me for myself, but rather because of my connection to Adrian. "A friend?" Adrian asked after a considerable pause. The man grew flushed beneath his lacquered hair. He looked uneasy, as if he had not expected so direct a response. "A long time ago," he said lamely. "Gabby and I have known each other since we were children." "Have you spoken to her lately?" Adrian asked, or at least I thought he asked. It was difficult to tell from his voice whether it was a question or a statement, but in any case, I understood it was a loaded and possibly aggressive thing to say. The man grew even more flushed. He looked over his shoulder and back to the party with longing. He must have been thinking that it had been a mistake to come out onto the balcony. When he joined us, he had the air of a man who had the upper hand, or believed himself to, but now he simply looked as if he were wondering how quickly he would be able to extricate himself from the situation. Adrian now turned to me. "Case is a good friend of my wife's." That was the first time he mentioned Gabby, or the fact that he was, or that he had been married. "The truth is," he continued, "they were lovers before Gabby and I were married, and although that was many years ago, they remained very close indeed, during the years of our marriage." I blinked at the phrase very close indeed. The insinuation was crude and out of character. Adrian continued, "I'm sure that Case is in touch with Gabby at this very moment. As for me, I know next to nothing of what she is doing, of what she is thinking, or even exactly where she is." "Please, Adrian," the man interrupted, his hands fluttering up to his hair. "I'm entirely on your side in this matter. I haven't spoken to Gabby in months, not since she left. She sends me the occasional email here and there, but nothing of significance, I promise you." Adrian stared at him a moment before turning back to me. "The 2 of them were on the phone together almost every night," he continued relentlessly. He was now almost loquacious. He spoke to me as if I were familiar with all the details of his marriage, when in reality he had told me nothing, not until that moment, not the fact that he had a wife, not even the fact that he had children. I understood well enough that Adrian was not speaking to me, but to Case, that I was only the medium through which his statements were passing, and similarly, I understood that my presence must have been what allowed Adrian to speak so directly. It was as if he were saying things he had wished to say for many years, but had been unable to, perhaps restrained by the basic courtesies of marriage, his respect for the long-standing friendship between his wife and this man. "Simply a confidant," Case said weakly, "and really against my will. She always called me. It was always at her instigation. I never called except in response to a message or a missed call. Why me rather than one of her many girlfriends? Well, I've no idea. And this was at all hours of day and night. I assure you I didn't enjoy the intimacy. It was sometimes rather annoying. He made a gesture of appeal to Adrian, who remained stony-faced, although I did not doubt that he knew more than he cared to about the man's tribulations. Probably Case had been a frequent dinner guest at their household, back when it had been a household, the couple's regular bachelor friend. Gabby was never very sensitive, Case said, and looked at Adrian with a little shrug as if to say, you, of course, would be the first to know that. But during those months, it became truly astonishing. It became so that I would not take her call unless I had the evening clear, a good hour or two, sometimes more. It was impossible to get her to stop talking. Of course, Gabby was very used to people listening to her, whatever her faults. You must admit that she was. Rather, she is, because it is not as if she has died. She's still with us, a fascinating woman. Gabby has always been herself, Adrian said irritably. Kay stared at him for a long moment and then nodded. Obviously, on this point, there could be no disagreement. He excused himself. There seemed to be nothing else to say. Adrian gave him a curt nod as he smoked another cigarette, and we left the party shortly after. Thank you. Sure. Thank you.
If there is time for some questions, so Katie has offered to take some questions from the audience. So please.
Hi, sorry.
No, question from someone who obviously hasn't read the book, but in the first reading, are we to know what language is being spoken and what language it's being translated into, or is that not important and it's simply the fact that she's interpreting that we're supposed to be drawing our attention to?
I think in that instance, it was, I did quite a lot of research for the book, and I went to the International Criminal Court, which is the court that the court in the novel is kind of loosely based on, and I spoke to a lot of interpreters. And, quite often interpreters will speak actually only two languages. It'll be English and French, which are the official languages of the court. And sometimes when there is a third or fourth language that needs to be translated into it, forms a kind of daisy chain of translation. So this character, Amina, would have been translating from Swahili into French, and then somebody else would translate from French into English. And so I think in the case of that excerpt, it's probably important in the sense that she was working in a language that only she and the accused were fluent in. And in other cases, often it will just, I think my character is primarily working just with French and English. But yeah, it is I think significant. I mean, it's a funny one because obviously the entire book is in English, and so it's always trying to work out how to still capture some of that dissonance or some of that gap of working between languages. And I think one of the ways that I hope to try to do that is sometimes my sentences have a syntax that isn't standard English and instead kind of taken from other languages. But yeah, thank you for that question. So, anybody else? Yes.
Two problems. Number one, are you yourself bi or multilingual? And then also, what is your favorite word or phrase in the language you're learning?
Oh, that's such a nice question. I grew up in a bilingual household. I grew up in a household where primarily only Japanese was spoken, and Japanese was almost my first language until I was about 5, and then so I'm older than many. And so when I was in kindergarten, I was slow to read and write, and the teachers told my parents to stop speaking Japanese to me in the home, which is, I think, an approach that is fairly common to people within my generation, but much less common now. So I have some Japanese, but it's kind of frozen in the language of like a 5-year-old child. So it's when I go to Japan, I'm always speaking. I think it's very strange for people because they meet me and I look like a grown woman, but then I have the manner of speech and the vocabulary of a child. But I think, to answer your question, I think experience of growing up in a dual language household was really profound. And although I didn't necessarily realize that when I started writing, I think the more I write, the more I realize that it really has its mark on a lot of my fiction, particularly my most recent book. And I love, I mean, this is such a, so Japanese for me is a language that I associate really powerfully with childhood, and it's a language I sometimes think in, but not all the time. But I started thinking in it a lot when I had children myself, and so a lot of the phrases and things that come to me are words that you would say to a child, but just speaking. I mean, there's a little tradition in Japan and other East Asian countries, I think, where you kind of clean the ears of your children. This sounds a bit particular, and I apologize. And the word for the tool is a mimikaki, and that's something that I started doing with my kids. So that's like a word, I guess, if you say that's a word right now in Japanese, and I'm really enjoying. But thank you. That's a lovely question.
Can you speak more to what you were saying about set pieces?
Yeah.
And you find kind of what you mean and process?
Yeah, I mean, that scene kind of goes on. It's quite a long scene. I think for me, a set piece is something that you're in a single location and you're in a single there's a container around it, a time frame, and in this book, a lot of the set pieces are either parties or the courtroom scenes, and I like to be inside of that space and kind of unpack it and kind of like make it distend a little bit. I think, one of the wonderful things about fiction is obviously you can move through scenes very, very quick. Like that entire scene could be, I went to a party where I met a man who told me that Adrian had been married. That's the kind of delivery in terms of plot. But I think for me, when I'm happiest writing, and this is really process rather than outcome on the page, but when I feel happiest writing is when I'm looking at a scene like that and kind of seeing how it can stretch, where I'm getting as granular as possible to the minutiae of what's happening between the characters within the scene. And I think, my very first book that I wrote was about mixed martial artists, and it was about sports, and it was about fighting. And I think one of the reasons I started writing fiction is I was fascinated by the fact when I would watch a sports game, for example, you have a very contained space and a very contained unit of time, and there are rules, and everything about it is artificial, and yet something that happens inside the ring or on the court or on the pitch is absolutely real. Like, it's as real as anything that you can touch. And I think fiction operates in a very similar way. And so I think that structure to some extent has remained in place for me. So then, I find writing, there's another scene, several scenes in the courtroom, that those scenes I can sometimes write quite quickly. The thing that I need to revise almost endlessly is the kind of plot summary, the exposition, the emotional through lines, everything that comes in between these set pieces and turns it into a novel. Does that answer your question? Okay. Sorry. Yes.
I'm curious about how you saw things with the language of interpretation rather than the language of translation.
Yeah.
And I was just wondering if that was just influenced by the language that they use for itself, or was that a more conscious choice?
Yeah, I mean, so interpretation is spoken and translation is written, and that's something that I think I thought of it as relatively so I should add that in the book that I wrote before this, which is called A Separation of the Central Character, is a translator, and there is a kind of she is a translator, and her partner is a writer, an author, and that distinction is in a funny way. It's not kind of as central to the book as interpretation is to this book, but it was kind of at the heart of their relationship in some fundamental way. And I was interested in that book and thinking about authorship and the question of who tells their story and who doesn't tell their story. So with interpretation, because it's spoken, it's obviously it's not about authorship in the sense that she's speaking the words of other people, but I think it's very much about performance. And that was something that I realized from talking to interpreters, is that you need to, that meaning isn't just contained in the word, but is in the delivery of the word, the context of the word, the energy, the aura around the word. And so much of the work of interpretation is also conveying that meaning. So that, for example, if something is said ironically, the interpreter needs to make it clear that it's ironic rather than literal. And so there's kind of so many different layers to the language, and that's really fascinating to me as a writer. I mean, I like writing. I like writing dialogue, but I like writing dialogue when you have like those layers of what the person is saying, what's happening around what the person's saying, what the person isn't saying, what they don't know they're not saying, and then what they are saying without knowing it. All those layers are really interesting to me. So interpretation is definitely a big, that the performative element is a big part of that. I should say that, you know, it's a kind of dicey thing to make a workplace your metaphor for your character, but she is an over interpreter. She interprets everything that's happening around her. So it is her work, but it's also somehow fundamental to how she relates to the world itself. Thank you. Sorry. Anybody else?
Do you find that your fascination with interpretation and communication influences how you perceive people's interpretations of your work?
I think ideally it would give me more equanimity. Because I think it's one of those, I genuinely do believe that once you write the book, it kind of exists in the space between the author and the reader, and you don't own the book. And I do believe that. And I think, with this book has been interesting because the elements that people seem to have responded to the most strongly were not the elements I thought they would respond to. I don't know what I thought. I don't know. I don't really write with I try not to write too much with a kind of reader's response too much in my head, but I think the reaction has been strongest to the love story, or the failed love story in the novel. And it was interesting, the reactions to the character of Adrian are much stronger than the reactions to the man who's on trial for war crimes, for example. So like I've had people have described the boyfriend as the villain of the novel rather than the war criminal, which has been fascinating. I mean, that's one of the strange things about fiction is that the kind of, and it is one of the things that I was interested in playing with is scale in the sense that you can have, and I think we live inside this space right now, but you have world historical events happening everywhere around you, and sometimes your ability to balance that is more important than anything else, but you're equally preoccupied with whether or not somebody has texted you back, for example. And so in that sense, I think that is completely fair for that response. So I find I'm interested by it at this stage, I will say. I'm not sure I could feel differently. Thank you. Yeah.
Have you been concerned about cultism and cult leaders in America, especially in the last 6-7 years, and movement from local cults to a national cult? And did that in any way influence your first reading?
Did you say cults?
Cults, C-U-L.
See, yeah, yes, and I mean, charisma is really an interesting thing, and and absolutely, this book was written in the atmosphere of the last 6 years. It's set in 2016, but it's written really in the energy of the last 6 years. And I think one thing that it has done is that my understanding of how language functions in relationship to charisma has changed. I think I thought charismatic speakers or gifted speakers were people who were very agile at communicating and manipulating language. And I've really learned that's not the case, that actually sometimes the bluntest message, sometimes a message that doesn't even make sense, if the staging around it is persuasive, it becomes persuasive. And so that has been really interesting to think about, for sure. I mean, I started writing the book because I heard, this was a long time ago, I think it was 2007 9. I was listening to the radio, I was listening to the BBC, and I heard an excerpt from the trial of Charles Taylor in The Hague, and he was speaking in his own defense. And it was that kind of funny thing of knowing that everything he was saying was false and ludicrous, and not even that sophisticated as an argument, but he was a persuasive speaker. And so there was like a separation between the persuasion of the language and the actual content of the language. And I think for writers, that is quite destabilizing, because we're used to thinking of often of language and writing as something that can reveal the truth and that clarifies. And in fact, often language does exactly the opposite. It obfuscates and it creates falsehood and confusion, and it can be manipulated to do either function. So I think, yeah, absolutely, in terms of my personal relationship to language and how language functions in relation to power, the last 6 years are everywhere in the book. Yeah. Thank you.
I think we might have time for one last question. All right, well, thank you so much. Give Katie Kitamura up. You're out. Thank you all for coming out. Please look to the future for more events from English and Creative Writing. I'd also like to say, because I always get nervous at the beginning of these things, I'd like to thank especially the Swanee Review, who was bringing Katie down for an event in Nashville and helped us make this trip to Swanee possible. I'd also like to thank the Swanee Writers Conference for bringing her here to Swanee several times before, so it can be a welcome return. Thank you all very much.